I'd like to talk to you about something that might be holding you back in your own development and studies, and even perhaps relationships with other people. Something that I myself will cop to having fallen into in the past. And I can see how problematic it winds up being, both in its effects and in the motivations. And so, what is it? Well, it's relying on cliched terms and ideas about other people and establishing dichotomies based on that, or rather, not even establishing them, just taking on somebody else's ideas and then applying them and dismissing important authors or other people on that basis. And I'm going to give you a prime example of what we're talking about. Then we'll talk about some other examples of these. And you might want to think about others that you've encountered and put them in the comments below. So when somebody uses the phrase ivory tower, and they add anything else, philosopher, academic, it's 99% sure that what is going to come next is going to be pretty piss poor BS, right? It's not going to be evidence of really having thought anything through, and probably they're going to get the person who they're targeting with that wrong. And I'll tell you a kind of funny story. So there was somebody recently that I had an exchange with on Twitter, and they were saying good things about me not being an ivory tower academic, but being the kind of person who would make philosophy applicable to real life for ordinary people, making it accessible. And I said, well, that's real nice. I'm glad that you appreciate the work I do. But I'll tell you, when I hear somebody use that phrase, ivory tower, I'm pretty sure that they're going to be full of crap, and I kind of tune out when they start talking about that sort of thing. And you might say, oh, aren't you doing exactly the same thing? Well, yes and no. I mean, it's based on a lot of experience of people using that sort of dismissive language. And this person was like, well, but a lot of philosophers are in ivory towers. And I was like, well, how in the hell would you know that? Have you actually spent much time with the people who you're making these claims about, to where you could say they are totally out of touch with ordinary people, with real life, with pick whatever else it is that, so dichotomy, real life over here, or common sense, or whatever you like, and ivory tower over here, totally out of touch, privileged, able to spin their fables to their select few and stuff like that. Is that really something that you yourself can talk about in a well-informed, evidence-based way? If not, then what's going on in your head when you're using that sort of dismissive, splitting the, one group of people over here and another group of people over here. And of course, the good people are the group that you belong to. And it wound up getting to the point where this person got quite hostile with me, and I actually just blocked them because I could see that they were very, very committed in a very dogmatic way to their hatred, dismissal, whatever you want to put it, of those terrible ivory tower types. And perhaps they came to suspect that I was an ivory tower type and I was just fooling them on the way out. I don't really know. But you see where this is going. There's a rigidity of thought that will not serve you in relying on these, at this point in time, just completely cliched locutions. These are the sort of things where maybe they actually made sense and contributed something useful when they were first coined, when people, started circulating them and saying, oh yeah, there's something to this. But in the 21st century, if you're dismissing people as belonging to the Ivory Tower, there's really something wrong with your approach to things. So, what are some other examples of this sort of mistaken point of view? Well, a really great one that I heard a lot when I was growing up and in college and university. I'm not book smart. I'm street smart, right? I know how the world works. I haven't read a lot of books, as if somehow reading books, which are typically about the world and they're situated within the world, is removing you from the workings, the messy, complex realities of how things truly are. I mean, books are, if they're good, they actually help you see more of reality. And the notion that you would somehow be street smart, okay, there's certain things that you learn by experience. There's a lot of things where having sort of an intuitive knack for it is useful. There are plenty of people, for example, who try to learn, say, dance or martial arts by reading about it in books. And yeah, that's not going to be particularly helpful. You need to move your body around and have somebody who knows about that guide you around. But, when it comes to academic subjects, you actually might want to be book smart. You might want to have read a lot of books. You notice books behind me, right? And they can help you with all sorts of other things. You want to know how to talk to people intelligently. There's an entire field called rhetoric, and some of the people who we study in philosophy, like Aristotle and Cicero, all the way down to, Chaim Perlman in the 20th century, made contributions to that important field. And what, you're going to not read books because you don't want to ruin your intuitive, street smart knack for that sort of thing? That's actually kind of foolish, I would say. Another very common example of this is calling people dogmatic versus, being open-minded. I mean, everybody is dogmatic in their own way, in that they believe in some sort of basic principles, wherever they happen to have gotten them from somebody else's books, from, intellectual Platonic contemplation, from abstraction, from experience, from, learning a skill. Everybody is dogmatic. There's nobody who is a complete skeptic or completely open-minded or not taking anything for granted or not making any assumptions. And anybody who tries to tell you that they're not is just doing a different sort of dogmatism, right? So dismissing people as merely dogmatic, that's kind of a problem, I would say. Another one that comes up a lot, common sense. And this is a really funny one because if you know much about the history of ideas, you know that this term has changed in its meaning throughout the years, right? The sensus communis, where does that come from? Well, I'm so glad you asked. It comes up in Aristotle, in his book On the Soul, right? And throughout the ancient period and all the way up to the early modern period, for many people, what the common sense means is that part of our mind that takes the input from the senses and puts them together so that we have notions of objects that can, not just be seen, but also heard and smelled and felt. That's what the common sense does. And then we get common sense, philosophy as an actual thing up in Scotland and exerting its influence in France and in America and the rest of Great Britain. We see Kant talking about Menschenverstand, which is often translated as common sense in his works and people's appeals to that. And nowadays, it's actually become a buzzword that's used very much by supposed conservatives who aren't really conservative. They're more of just populist or, alt-right or fascists or people like that. because they haven't actually held on to the principles of conservatism that conservatism looked like years and years ago. That's a totally different subject that we'll get into in another place. But appeals to, I have common sense, this person doesn't. Common sense, is not some trump card that tells you that you understand things and other people don't. Very often, the person who's appealing to common sense is going to be sloppy and stupid, if that's all they've got going for them. Another thing I've already mentioned, talking about real life. I mean, it's all real life. The so-called Ivory Tower is also part of real life. I'll actually tell you a kind of funny story. When I was in basic training in the Army, we would always say, oh man, when I get back to the real world. And I remember there was a guy who was older and he was like, you dummies, don't you understand that this is as real as whatever place you think you're going to or wherever you wanted to go back to? All of it's the real world. So you're not, privileged by having this little bit of the stuff that you call the real world. You're actually living in your own fantasy, imaginary world if you think that that is the whole real world. We also see people talking about, oh, those people just do theory. I actually do practice. This is a big problem, by the way, in the modern philosophy as a way of life communities, particularly Stoicism, where people are like, oh, I'm not going to actually read Stoic texts. I'm just going to, do practices like memento mori, which not Stoic, by the way. That's a Nietzschean phrase, or which they'd know if they actually read anything. Or negative visualization, or the view from above, or pick whatever you want, right? And, if you're not actually reading, then you might not actually understand even the practices that you're using and their limitations and when you should do them and when you shouldn't. Pierre Hadot has pointed out in his Philosophy as a Way of Life that reading for the ancient philosophers who did philosophy as a way of life is a practice that you cannot avoid, right? And I think a similar one that comes up, and I've even seen people who I consider intelligent falling into this trap, is contrasting people who are academics or who speak in an academic way, meaning that they actually understand things, but it's complex and they can't really reach the ordinary person, versus people who are more popular or accessible. And they ignore the fact that there's plenty of us speakers who have the academic chops and can actually talk to ordinary people of all different walks of life and make the Stoicism, Aristotelianism, Hegel even, make sense to them. And they lose sight of this because they want to have a nice dividing line. And these dichotomies, sometimes they could actually have some truth to them, but most of the time they are ways of thinking that get in the way. They hold you back. So if you find yourself appealing to these a lot, you might want to take a look at your own assumptions, your own practice, and whether you're getting what you want from them. And I've got a couple reflections that I'll share with you. So you might want to think with any of these, like if you're talking about the Ivory Tower, where did you get that idea from? Did you read it in a book somewhere? Did you see it on blogs? Did you hear people talking about it on podcasts? You sure as hell didn't come up with this idea on your own. You just took somebody else's idea and you're kind of glomming onto it and using it probably in the same way, unimaginatively, as you've seen all sorts of other people do. Is that really how you want to use your own mind? So, think about that. And then are the people who you're dismissing, whether it's Ivory Tower or lacking common sense or out of touch with, real life, are they really like that? How do you know that they are? Have you spent enough time reading their works? Have you spent enough time engaging with them to know that they really are out of touch? I mean, some people are quite out of touch. Some people are entitled. Some people are so privileged that they have no idea how things work in other places. And some of them are in academia, but plenty of them are in businesses. Plenty of them are, people who work ordinary day jobs, and they don't know any more about the real world than the academics who they're dismissing do. So you want to ask yourself, do you actually know this? And is this a way for you to stress the positive value of what it is that you like? If you're attracted to philosophy as a way of life, which is great, are you contrasting it against traditional academic philosophy because that makes you feel better, like you're actually in touch with something that truly matters, not like those eggheads who waste their time logic chopping, pick whatever other cliches you want to use? Is that a way to compensate for feelings of insecurity, of not really knowing what your own positive value is? You should also ask yourself, what are you actually getting out of this attachment to phrases like that? Are you getting anything positive out of it, or are you joining in a game where people say stuff like that and the conversations remain very superficial? You don't manage to articulate what really matters to you because you're dismissing other people instead and making yourself feel good in the process. Another thing you should think about, how does it come about that, at least in certain areas of our communicative space, being an expert, that means actually possessing expertise and talent and a body of knowledge that you have acquired over time, how is that a bad thing? How is that somehow lesser than somebody watching YouTube videos or reading Wikipedia articles or cherry picking, studies done by other academics? And those are the good academics, right? Or, reading books and saying, well, Emerson talks about real life and these other philosophers don't. How is it that somehow things got turned on their head and being an expert is now a bad thing for knowing about a particular subject? And I'm not going to deny that there aren't plenty of experts who are, once you get out of their little area of expertise, totally at sea, can't communicate not just with ordinary people, but even with other experts in different fields. That's quite true. But to dismiss expertise as a matter of course, that strikes me as making all sorts of foolish assumptions, and it's not going to work out for you well. And I can tell you, I've done that myself at different points. Didn't work out for me. So, do you always have to avoid these cliches? No. I mean, it might be okay to talk about the Ivory Tower once in a very long while, but if you're using that commonly as a phrase to dismiss entire groups of people, or to say, I don't need to read that book, it's by some Ivory Tower person, you're actually depriving yourself. You're screwing yourself over. And you don't want to do that, do you? Is that the sort of life of the mind that you envision for yourself? Is that a good thing? So I'm going to close here with a suggestion that has to do with the Ivory Tower. And it's a transformation, let's say, of the metaphor. And we can keep the ivory because it's nice to have a big white tower, isn't it? I mean, an ivory tower, obviously you should be harvesting ivory and making a tower like that. So let's just say a nice white, cement tower or something like that. And why am I saying white? Because the thing that I would say we should talk about, its function is enhanced by being bright. It could be yellow, it could be orange, could be whatever you want. Instead of an ivory tower, let's think of a lighthouse. What does a lighthouse do? It helps to guide you. It helps to, get the ship in without hitting the shoals or reefs or rocks that otherwise might tear its bottom open and result in loss of life or cargo or inconvenience or whatever. It's a guide for you. It helps you out. And Baudelaire, who is one of my favorite poets, actually has a poem, Les Phares. So a phare is a lighthouse. And he talks about these great thinkers, great writers, as being lighthouses who help us guide our way in. And so many of the people who you might dismiss as being, ivory tower intellectuals or academics, maybe, at least some of them, are living in the lighthouse instead and are there to help you out if you're willing to accept that help, that guidance that they have to offer you. And that's entirely up to you. But using these cliches, making these strict dichotomies where one thing is over here and the other thing is over here, that's going to stand in the way. So that's probably enough said about this particular topic. Some food for thought. And if you can think of other interesting phrases like this, go ahead and put them in the comments. I didn't come up with, like an exhaustive list, and I'd be interested to see what other people have to say about that.